Unaware she is the secret billionaire CEO buying out his empire, he made his wife to serve drinks at his engagement. But she arrived with 10 Rolls, Royce and his mother, and what she did destroyed his life. Ethan Morrison had built his reputation on ruthless decisions, but forcing his ex-wife Ava to serve cocktails at his engagement party to Vanessa Hartley was perhaps his cruelest power play yet. Except the woman approaching the venue in a motorcade of 10 Rolls-Royces wasn't the broken, powerless mother of his twins he remembered. For 5 years, Ava had endured his coldness, watching him transform from the struggling entrepreneur she'd funded with her own money into a man who openly mocked her ordinary appearance at business dinners. But what Ethan never knew was that every humiliation, every dismissive comment, every moment he'd made her feel invisible had been carefully documented by someone with the resources to end him. Tonight was supposed to be his coronation, the final public severing from his past, the celebration of his arrival into true elite circles with a glamorous fiancée who fit his new image. But the guest list he'd approved included investors who were secretly negotiating with a mysterious billionaire CEO buying up his company's debt. His mother, Patricia Morrison, had been unusually quiet during the party planning, her usually warm relationship with her son strained by something she couldn't quite name, but Ethan had dismissed her concerns as maternal jealousy of Vanessa, never suspecting that Patricia had been working as Ava's executive secretary since the divorce, learning what real leadership looked like from the woman her son had thrown away. The ballroom hushed when the convoy arrived, security guards frozen in confusion as Ava emerged not in a server's uniform, but in an ensemble that screamed understated wealth. But the earthquake truly hit when Patricia Morrison stepped out beside her, wearing not a guest's attire, but the professional suit of a high-level executive serving her employer. Ethan's hand went slack, releasing Vanessa's waist as he watched his mother, his own mother, walk in formation with the woman he'd just finished telling his investors was too simple to understand business. But the truth, spreading through the crowd like wildfire, was far worse than family betrayal. How would Ethan explain to his shocked fiancée and business partners that the woman he'd publicly humiliated was actually the billionaire CEO who now owned 47% of his company? What would happen when Ava revealed not just her wealth, but the years of manipulation, the secrets his mother had shared, the evidence of every lie he'd told to cover his failing business? And could any man survive the moment when everyone he'd tried to impress learned that his success was never his own, that the woman serving drinks in his cruel fantasy was actually the one holding every string? Dear viewers, this story is about the devastating cost of arrogance and the quiet power of underestimated people. You'll learn that true strength isn't always loud, that treating people as disposable based on their appearance or status can destroy you, and that the bridges you burn might be the only paths back to what matters. This tale explores how pride blinds us to the value of those who sacrifice for us, and how justice, though delayed, eventually finds those who mistake kindness for weakness. You'll see how a man's empire, built on someone else's foundation, crumbles when that foundation walks away. Please drop in the comments what lessons you learned from this story and what you would have done differently if you were in Ava's position. Would you have revealed yourself sooner, or was her timing perfect? Would you have given Ethan any chance at redemption, or was complete destruction the only justice? Subscribe for more interesting, entertaining, and educative stories that explore the consequences of our choices and the power of patience, dignity, and strategic thinking in the face of betrayal. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom sparkled with the kind of elegance that money could rent but not buy. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across tables draped in silk, but Ethan Morrison stood at the center of it all, knowing that tonight wasn't just about celebrating his engagement, it was about erasing the last visible evidence of his humble beginnings. Vanessa Hartley clung to his arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light with every calculated gesture, her laugh pitched perfectly to charm the investors and board members who'd gathered to witness what society pages were already calling the merger of the season. But the woman who'd actually merged her life with Ethan's a decade ago was currently standing in the kitchen, receiving instructions from a catering manager who had no idea she was addressing the ex-wife of the groom. Ava had received the text message 3 days earlier, clinical and brief, like everything Ethan communicated these days. The engagement party is Saturday. I've arranged for you to work the event. Servers make $200 for the night. You need the money. Be there at 6 p.m. sharp. She'd stared at those words for a full minute, her twin daughters, Harper and Grace, playing in the living room of the modest apartment Ethan assumed was the best she could afford. But what he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to investigate, was that this apartment was merely one of 17 properties Ava owned across 3 states. The humiliation he'd intended was based on a fiction he'd constructed in his own mind, a story where leaving her had been an act of mercy rather than betrayal, but Ava had learned long ago that correcting Ethan's delusions was less useful than allowing him to drown in them. "You'll be serving champagne during the toast," the catering manager explained, gesturing toward a tray of crystal flutes. "Mr. Morrison specifically requested additional servers for the main ballroom. High-profile guests tonight." The young woman had no idea she was speaking to someone who could buy the hotel with a single phone call. But Ava simply nodded, her movements calm and practiced. Because composure under pressure was a skill she'd mastered long before Ethan Morrison had entered her life. The kitchen buzzed with activity, but Eva's mind traveled backward, retracing the path that had led her to this moment, remembering the version of Ethan who'd knocked on her college dorm room door 12 years ago, nervous and brilliant, pitching a business idea he believed would change everything. She'd fallen in love with his ambition before she'd fallen in love with him, and that had been her first mistake, because ambition without gratitude is just appetite. And Ethan's appetite had proven bottomless. He'd needed $40,000 to launch his first tech prototype, and Ava had withdrawn it from the trust fund her late father had left her, money she'd been saving for graduate school. But Ethan's eyes had shone with such certainty that she'd convinced herself she was investing in their future. The prototype had failed within 6 months, but Ethan had learned from it, pivoting to a new concept, and this time Ava had liquidated her mother's antique jewelry collection, pieces that had been in her family for generations, to fund his second attempt. That one had gained traction, attracting a small venture capital investment, and suddenly Ethan was being invited to pitch competitions and networking events. But Ava had been 7 months pregnant with the twins and hadn't fit into the sleek cocktail dresses the other entrepreneurs' girlfriends wore. "You don't need to come to these things," Ethan had said, his tone gentle but firm. "They're boring anyway, just a bunch of guys talking shop. Stay home and rest." She'd believed he was being considerate, but now, standing in a hotel kitchen preparing to serve drinks at his engagement party, she recognized that moment as the first time he'd made her invisible. The second time had come when the twins were 18 months old and Morrison Tech Solutions had landed its first major client. Ethan had thrown a celebration dinner, inviting investors and board members, but when Ava had arrived with the girls in a stroller, he'd introduced her simply as "my wife" before steering conversation immediately back to business, never mentioning that the woman beside him had been the sole financial backer when every bank had rejected his loan applications. The third time, the fourth time, the 100th time, they'd blurred together into a pattern she'd been too exhausted to fight, but exhaustion and acceptance were different things, and Ava had never truly accepted the role Ethan had written for her. She'd simply waited, watching him build his empire on foundations he'd convinced himself he'd poured alone. But foundations remember who mixed their concrete, and Ava had been planning this reckoning since the day he'd served her divorce papers at Harper and Grace's 5th birthday party, his lawyer present, his new girlfriend waiting in the car outside, his face showing no trace of the man who'd once promised her forever. The ballroom had reached that perfect pitch of sophisticated celebration where champagne flowed freely and inhibitions loosened just enough for honest opinions to surface. But the honest opinion spreading through Ethan's carefully curated guest list was that Vanessa Hartley was exactly the kind of woman a man married when he valued appearances over substance. She held court near the dessert table, her voice carrying across marble floors as she explained to a cluster of admirers how she'd saved Ethan from a completely boring life, unaware that several of the investors listening had begun receiving anonymous emails over the past month detailing irregularities in Morrison Tech Solutions' financial statements. Ethan himself stood surrounded by board members, his confidence absolute as he outlined his 5-year expansion plan, but the expansion he was describing required capital he no longer controlled, loans that had been quietly purchased by shell corporations he'd never heard of, debts that had been strategically consolidated under new ownership. Patricia Morrison watched her son from across the room, her champagne glass untouched, her expression carefully neutral, but inside, she was calculating exactly how the next 20 minutes would unfold. She tried to warn him 3 months ago, sitting across from him at lunch, choosing her words carefully. "Ethan, honey, are you certain about this engagement? Have you thought about Harper and Grace? Have you thought about what you're throwing away?" He'd laughed, actually laughed, before responding, "Mom, Ava was fine when I was nobody. But I'm not nobody anymore. I need someone who fits." Patricia had wanted to tell him then, wanted to explain that the woman he'd dismissed as fine was currently negotiating the purchase of his largest competitor. But her loyalty had shifted the day she'd watched Ava handle a hostile board meeting with more grace and strategic brilliance than Ethan had displayed in his entire career. The job offer had come 6 months after the divorce, delivered through a headhunter who'd approached Patricia at a charity function. "We have a client looking for an executive secretary with specific qualifications: discretion, loyalty, and personal experience with Morrison Tech Solutions." Patricia had almost declined until she'd learned the client's identity, and then curiosity had pulled her to that first meeting where Ava had sat across a desk in an office that occupied an entire floor of a building Ethan had once pointed to, saying, "Someday, I'll have a space like that." The irony had been devastating, but Eva's offer had been professional and clear. "I'm not asking you to betray your son. I'm asking you to work for someone who values your intelligence. What you choose to share with me about his business practices is entirely your decision." Patricia had shared everything, not out of spite, but out of concern. Watching Ethan make reckless decisions, over-leveraging his company, falsifying projections to attract investors, treating employees with the same dismissive arrogance he'd shown Ava, but every warning she'd offered him had been brushed aside with patronizing smiles. "Mom, you don't understand business," he'd say, never knowing that his mother now sat in strategy meetings with a CEO whose quarterly revenue exceeded his annual projections. The sound that interrupted her thoughts was subtle at first, a low rumble that grew progressively louder, and Patricia checked her watch. 8:47 p.m., exactly on schedule. The first Rolls-Royce appeared in the circular driveway like a period at the end of a sentence, its pristine silver body reflecting the hotel's exterior lights. But before the valets could process what they were seeing, 9 more vehicles pulled into formation behind it, a display of wealth so excessive that guests began moving toward the windows. Ethan noticed the commotion, his conversation with the board members trailing off as he followed their distracted gazes. But he assumed some other wealthy guest had arrived fashionably late. Perhaps someone Vanessa had invited to inflate the guest list's prestige. Vanessa herself had rushed to the window, her practiced social smile ready, but that smile fractured when the lead vehicle's door opened and a woman emerged who looked nothing like the servers in the kitchen. Ava had chosen her outfit with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments, a midnight blue evening gown that cost more than Ethan's car, jewelry that was understated but unmistakably authentic, hair styled in a way that suggested she had people whose job was ensuring she looked effortlessly elegant. But the most devastating accessory was her expression, calm, controlled, and completely untouchable. She moved with the confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet, and technically, through a subsidiary corporation, she owned a 12% stake in the hotel itself, but Ethan didn't know that yet. What he was about to learn, however, was that the second figure emerging from the Rolls-Royce was his mother, and Patricia Morrison was not dressed as a guest. The professional suit she wore was tailored perfectly. Her posture, that of an executive assistant taking position beside her employer, and when she moved to Eva's side, not embracing her, not greeting her as family, but standing in the unmistakable formation of employee and employer. The ballroom's energy shifted from curiosity to confusion to dawning shock. Ethan's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confidence draining into bewilderment, bewilderment hardening into anger. But before he could formulate words, the hotel's general manager appeared, flanked by security, and the confusion on their faces made it clear they'd received instructions that contradicted Ethan's assumptions about who controlled this evening. Mrs. Chen, the manager addressed Ava, using the name from her corporate identity. Your party has arrived. Shall we proceed as planned? Ava nodded graciously, and that simple gesture, the way the hotel's most senior staff deferred to her, sent ripples through the crowd faster than any announcement could have. But the investors who'd been negotiating with mysterious representatives for weeks suddenly understood exactly who'd been on the other end of those phone calls. Vanessa's hand found Ethan's arm, her grip tight, her voice a whispered hiss. Who is that? Why is your mother dressed like that? Ethan, what's happening? He had no answer, because the world he'd constructed so carefully, the narrative where he'd risen from nothing through pure talent and determination, was about to be demolished by the woman he'd ordered to serve drinks. But Ava wasn't carrying a tray. She was carrying documents, contracts, and the kind of truth that destroys men who've built their thrones on lies. And as she walked toward him across the marble floor, every eye in the ballroom tracking her movement, Ethan Morrison finally understood what it felt like to be invisible, powerless, and completely at someone else's mercy. The silence in the ballroom was the kind that precedes earthquakes. Every guest frozen in position as Ava approached the center of the room where Ethan stood beside Vanessa. But what made the moment truly devastating was that Ava didn't rush, didn't perform, didn't offer any of the emotional theatrics Ethan had been preparing to dismiss as a scorned woman's breakdown. She simply walked with the measured pace of someone who owned the room, because through various corporate entities, she quite literally owned 47% of everything Ethan believed was his, and the remaining 53% was about to become irrelevant. Good evening, Ethan, Ava said, her voice carrying across the marble floors with perfect clarity. I apologize for arriving late to your celebration, but I was finalizing some paperwork that required my immediate attention. She gestured to Patricia, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio, her movements crisp and professional, her eyes never quite meeting her son's face. But the betrayal in Ethan's expression suggested he was finally understanding that this wasn't a surprise appearance, it was a planned execution. Vanessa's confusion had evolved into something sharper, her social instincts recognizing a power dynamic she'd completely misread. But before she could formulate a response, Ava addressed the room at large, her tone conversational, yet somehow carrying the weight of a courtroom verdict. Many of you know me as Ethan's ex-wife, she began, and several guests shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they were witnessing a scene or something more calculated. Some of you remember me from the early days of Morrison Tech Solutions, back when Ethan was pitching his first prototype. But very few of you know that the initial capital that launched this company, $40,000, came from my family trust fund. She paused, letting that information settle, watching recognition dawn on the faces of the original investors who'd assumed Ethan had been self-funded. The second round of funding, $65,000, came from liquidating my mother's jewelry collection. The third round, $90,000, came from a loan I personally guaranteed against my inheritance. Ethan's voice finally emerged, rough and desperate. This is ridiculous. Ava, you're embarrassing yourself. We were married. That money was community property, investment in our future, but Ava simply opened the portfolio Patricia handed her, extracting documents with the calm efficiency of someone who'd anticipated every possible objection. You're absolutely right that we were married, she agreed, her tone almost kind, which is why I have documentation of every financial transaction, every loan, every liquidated asset, all predating our marriage by several months. You see, Ethan, you proposed to me 3 weeks after I gave you the $40,000 for your first prototype. The prosecution might call that romantic timing. I call it strategic. The investors who'd been standing beside Ethan began taking small steps backward, their expressions shifting from supportive to evaluative, recalculating everything they thought they knew about Morrison Tech Solutions' origin story. But Ava wasn't finished. She extracted another document, this one bearing the logo of Hartwell Financial Group, and held it up so the room could see. For the past 14 months, Hartwell Financial, a company I've owned for 7 years under my maiden name, has been systematically purchasing Morrison Tech Solutions' outstanding debts, your overdue vendor payments, and your revolving credit lines. As of yesterday afternoon, we completed acquisition of 47% of your company's total equity through a combination of debt conversion and strategic stock purchases from shareholders who'd lost confidence in your leadership. The room erupted in whispers, board members pulling out phones to verify what their contracts said about change of control provisions. But Ethan's face had gone beyond anger into something resembling disbelief. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction because deep down he was finally recognizing the woman standing before him. Not the quiet wife he'd dismissed, but the business strategist who'd been patient enough to wait for him to destroy himself. Vanessa had released his arm entirely now, her survival instincts pulling her toward the periphery where she could distance herself from whatever was about to happen. But Eva's attention never wavered from Ethan. What's impossible, Ava continued, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, is that you actually believed your success was self-made, that you convinced yourself the capital appeared from nowhere, that the connections I provided through my family didn't matter, that the years I spent raising our daughters alone while you networked at conferences somehow made me less valuable than the people impressed by your presentations. She stepped closer, and Ethan instinctively stepped back, a reversal that didn't escape the notice of watching investors. But what's truly impossible is that you thought humiliating me one more time, making me serve drinks at your engagement party, would somehow erase the foundation I built for you. Patricia finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Ethan, I tried to warn you. I tried to tell you that success without gratitude is just borrowed time, but you stopped listening to anyone who reminded you where you came from. The betrayal on Ethan's face when he looked at his mother was absolute. But Patricia held her ground, years of watching her son's transformation into someone she didn't recognize, finally reaching their breaking point. Ava didn't ask me to spy on you. She offered me a job where my intelligence was valued, where my contributions mattered, and where loyalty went both directions. Something you stopped offering the moment you decided your mother's advice was beneath you. The board members had clustered near the exit now, their phones lighting up with messages from their own legal teams. But one of them, Richard Chen, the company's largest independent investor, stepped forward with a question that cut through the chaos. If you own 47%, you can't force a sale without majority control. What exactly are you proposing? Ava smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting for that exact question. "I'm not proposing anything, Richard. I'm informing you that as of tomorrow morning, Morrison Tech Solutions will be entering Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection." You see, the company currently owes Hartwell Financial $9 million in consolidated debt, payment due in 30 days. But Ethan has been using creative accounting to hide the fact that his actual liquid assets total less than $2 million. The room went completely silent, the implications spreading like poison through water, but Ethan's voice emerged as a roar. "You can't do this! I'll fight you in court! I'll expose you! Ava simply handed him a document from the portfolio, her expression never changing. "You'll do nothing, Ethan, because this document is your own financial statement from last quarter, the one you submitted to the SEC, and these highlighted sections are the projections you inflated by 300%. Fraud is a federal crime, and I have a complete record of every false statement you've made to investors over the past 18 months because your own mother, was so concerned about your behavior that she documented everything, hoping someone could stop you before you destroyed yourself." Vanessa had reached the exit now, her designer dress disappearing into the hallway as she abandoned the sinking ship she'd been so eager to board. But Ethan's eyes followed her with the desperate realization that he was losing everything simultaneously: his company, his reputation, his fiancée, and any remaining relationship with his mother. The investors were already drafting their own legal responses, protecting their positions, but Ava had one final revelation that would complete his destruction. The bankruptcy proceedings will include a full audit of Morrison Tech Solutions' finances, which means the IRS will discover the offshore accounts you've been using to hide personal income. I estimate you're looking at somewhere between 8 and 12 federal charges, but my lawyers are better at predicting these things than I am. Ethan collapsed into a chair, his face pale, his hands shaking, but Ava remained standing, her composure absolute, because this moment, this public dismantling of the man who'd made her feel worthless for years, wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about ensuring that arrogance and cruelty carried consequences, and about protecting her daughters from inheriting their father's belief that people were disposable. Patricia moved to stand beside Ava, her choice made public and irrevocable. And as the ballroom emptied, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. 3 months later, their cameras trained on the entrance where Ethan Morrison would soon emerge from what his lawyer was already calling the worst custody hearing in recent memory. But the real story was unfolding in the courtroom's deliberation chamber, where Judge Maria Santos was reviewing evidence that painted a portrait of fatherhood so neglectful it bordered on abandonment. Ava sat in the plaintiff's gallery, her lawyers flanking her with the quiet confidence of people who'd prepared for every possible defense. But the truth was that no amount of preparation had been necessary because Ethan had destroyed himself more thoroughly than any opposing counsel ever could. The bankruptcy proceedings had been brutal and public. Morrison Tech Solutions' collapse making headlines in every business publication. But what had truly captivated the media was the human story beneath the financial wreckage. A self-made billionaire, revealing herself to be the ex-wife her former husband had ordered to serve drinks at his engagement party. The optics were devastating for Ethan. Photographs of Ava emerging from corporate headquarters she now controlled, images of Patricia Morrison standing beside her in professional capacity, interviews with former employees who described Ethan's arrogance and Ava's quiet competence. The narrative had written itself, and public opinion had rendered its verdict long before the legal system caught up. Vanessa Hartley had given exactly one interview to a lifestyle magazine desperate for insider details, where she described Ethan as charming, but ultimately hollow, the kind of man who mistakes acquisition for achievement. before disappearing into a relationship with a hedge fund manager whose wealth didn't require verification. The engagement ring had been returned via courier, accompanied by a note Ethan's lawyer had advised him to destroy, but the damage to his reputation among the social circles he'd cultivated so carefully was irreversible. He'd become a cautionary tale, the man who'd thrown away everything real in pursuit of everything superficial, but the final accounting of his losses was still being calculated in the custody hearing that would determine his relationship with Harper and Grace. The girls were 7 now, old enough to have opinions about their father that the court-appointed psychologist had documented with clinical precision. Harper states that Daddy only calls on birthdays and sometimes forgets, while Grace reports that Daddy promises to visit, but his assistant always cancels. The psychologist's report ran 47 pages, each one a catalog of missed recitals, forgotten parent-teacher conferences, and birthday parties attended by nannies while Ethan networked at industry events. What emerged was a pattern of a father who'd viewed his daughters as accessories to be displayed when convenient, but delegated to staff when actual parenting was required. And the contrast with Ava's documented involvement. Every school event, every doctor's appointment, every bedtime story was stark enough to eliminate any question about custody. Ethan's lawyer had tried to argue that Ava's corporate responsibilities made her equally unavailable, but the rebuttal had been simple and devastating. Mrs. Chen restructured her entire executive calendar around her daughter's schedules. She conducts board meetings via video conference during school hours and maintains a strict policy of no business calls after 6 p.m. Mr. Morrison, by contrast, missed his daughter's 6th birthday party because he was attending a networking event in Miami, despite living 20 minutes from the venue. The evidence wasn't just documented. It was overwhelming. Years of Ethan's choices crystallized into a record that couldn't be argued away or reframed. But Ethan had one final strategy, desperate and cruel. He'd subpoenaed financial records attempting to prove that Ava's wealth had been hidden during their divorce, that she'd committed fraud by not disclosing her assets, that the settlement should be reopened. His lawyer had presented this argument with visible discomfort, knowing it was more likely to anger the judge than generate sympathy, but Ethan had insisted, unable to accept that his destruction was entirely self-inflicted. The response from Ava's legal team had been precise. Mrs. Chen's wealth was accumulated entirely after the divorce through legitimate business acquisitions. Mr. Morrison was offered a fair settlement based on the marital assets he was aware of at the time. His failure to investigate his ex-wife's post-divorce activities does not constitute fraud on her part. Chen's wealth was accumulated entirely after the divorce through legitimate business acquisitions. Mr. Morrison was offered a fair settlement based on the marital assets he was aware of at the time. His failure to investigate his ex-wife's post-divorce activities does not constitute fraud on her part. Judge Santos emerged from chambers at 2:47 p.m., her expression giving nothing away, but the speed of her deliberation suggested the decision hadn't been difficult. She took her position behind the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and began speaking in the measured tone of someone delivering a verdict she knew would make headlines. In the matter of Morrison versus Chen, regarding custody of minor children, Harper Elizabeth Morrison and Grace Annabelle Morrison, this court finds clear and convincing evidence that the best interests of the children are served by awarding primary physical custody to the plaintiff, Ava Chen, with supervised visitation rights, granted to the defendant, Ethan Morrison, pending completion of court-mandated parenting classes and psychological evaluation. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Santos continued, her words carrying the weight of legal finality. This court notes that Mr. Morrison's pattern of prioritizing professional advancement over parental responsibility, his documented history of broken promises to his children, and his demonstrated instability during recent business and personal crises make unsupervised custody inappropriate at this time. Furthermore, this court is troubled by Mr. Morrison's apparent belief that custody rights can be weaponized in service of financial disputes with his former spouse. Children are not bargaining chips, Mr. Morrison, and your attempt to use them as such reflects poorly on your fitness as a parent. Ethan sat motionless beside his lawyer, his face expressionless, but his hands gripped the table edge with enough force that his knuckles had gone white. Across the aisle, Ava allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief, not triumph. She'd never wanted this battle, had hoped Ethan would choose his daughters over his pride, but relief that Harper and Grace would be protected from a father who viewed them as assets rather than human beings. Patricia Morrison sat in the public gallery, tears streaming down her face, mourning the son she'd raised and the stranger he'd become, but her position beside Ava's legal team made her loyalties clear. The hearing concluded with scheduling details for supervised visitation every other Saturday afternoon, 2 hours at a family services center where trained professionals would monitor Ethan's interactions with his daughters. But as the judge dismissed the court, Ethan finally broke his silence. He stood abruptly, turning to face Ava across the courtroom divide, and his voice carried the desperate edge of a man with nothing left to lose. This isn't over. You've taken my company, my reputation, my home. You won't take my children. Ava stood slowly, gathering her documents with deliberate calm, and when she finally met his eyes, her expression held no anger, no satisfaction, only the tired patience of someone explaining reality to a person determined to deny it. I didn't take anything from you, Ethan. You gave it all away, traded your family for status, your integrity for appearance, your children's love for the approval of strangers who've already forgotten your name. The company I acquired was failing because you'd built it on lies. The reputation you lost was always false, maintained through manipulation and my silent support. And your children? She paused, letting the weight of that question settle. You lost them the first time you promised to attend a dance recital and sent your assistant with an excuse instead. She moved toward the exit, Patricia falling into step beside her, but Ethan's voice followed them, cracking with something that might have been genuine emotion. I can change. I can be better. Just give me another chance. Tell the judge I deserve another chance. Ava stopped at the courtroom door, her back still turned, and for a moment, the years between them collapsed into the memory of a younger man who'd knocked on her college dorm room door, nervous and brilliant, before ambition had calcified into arrogance. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only Ethan and those closest could hear. You had chances, Ethan. Thousands of them. Every morning you woke up beside a woman who loved you. Every evening you came home to daughters who waited for your attention. Every moment someone offered you loyalty and you chose advancement instead. Those were your chances. She turned to face him one final time, and the woman standing in that courthouse doorway bore no resemblance to the invisible wife he'd dismissed. You thought I was too small to matter, that my contributions were forgettable, that people who didn't serve your ambition were disposable? That was the biggest mistake of your life. But it wasn't the mistake of underestimating me. It was the mistake of underestimating what you were throwing away. I hope someday you understand the difference. The courthouse doors closed behind her, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions, but Ava walked past them all with Patricia at her side, climbing into a town car where Harper and Grace waited with their favorite books and snacks for the drive home. The girls asked if they could stop for ice cream, and Ava said yes because there was no meeting, no conference call, no business obligation more important than this moment with her daughters. Behind them, through the courthouse windows, Ethan Morrison stood alone in an empty courtroom, finally understanding what it meant to lose everything that mattered while still having a pulse. Finally learning that some destructions are so complete that the rubble becomes your permanent address. 6 months later, business publications would report that Chen Holdings had absorbed Morrison Tech Solutions' viable assets and restructured the company into profitability, creating 200 new jobs and establishing a corporate culture based on respect rather than fear. Patricia Morrison would be named Chief Operating Officer, her son's name conspicuously absent from all company materials. And Ethan Morrison would complete his court-mandated parenting classes, attend his supervised visits with increasing regularity, and begin the slow, uncertain process of learning to be a father rather than a figurehead, not because the court required it, but because the alternative was watching his daughters grow up in photographs while he remained a stranger they were obligated to see every other Saturday. But on this afternoon, as Ava sat in an ice cream shop watching Harper and Grace debate the merits of chocolate versus vanilla, she allowed herself something she'd denied for years: the simple satisfaction of knowing that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Not revenge. Revenge would have been easy, emotionally satisfying, but ultimately hollow. Justice required patience, strategy, and the willingness to let a man destroy himself while you quietly built something better from the pieces he'd discarded. And as Grace climbed into her lap, sticky-fingered and laughing, Ava understood that the greatest victory wasn't the empire she'd acquired or the man she'd defeated. It was this moment, this ordinary afternoon with her daughters, free from the shadow of someone who'd tried to make her feel worthless. The story could have ended differently, she thought. Ethan could have chosen gratitude over arrogance, partnership over domination, love over status. But some people need to lose everything before they understand what anything was worth. And by then, the people they've discarded have already built new lives where cruelty has no address and second chances are earned rather than demanded. Ava had learned that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, the calm state of having moved so completely beyond someone that their destruction brings no pleasure, only the quiet certainty that justice has been served and life continues, richer and freer, in their absence. As Ethan knelt in ruin, begging for another chance, Ava looked at him coldly and said, "You thought I was too small to matter. That was the biggest mistake of your life."